Mannerism is a sub-style of the Renaissance style. So on an exam, depending on what your teacher or your professor is asking for, probably the safest thing to do would be to put down Renaissance as a style and then a hyphen or a colon and say Mannerism. For my class, you could probably just put down Mannerism. I might give you half credit for writing in Renaissance. Michelangelo is probably the father of the Mannerist style, and some people even say he was a Mannerist, but I don't think he was. And when we studied him, we looked at the Last Judgment that he did that was kind of had some Mannerist things, some distortions in terms of the figures in terms of his Last Judgment that were very Mannerist in style. But also in architecture, we looked at San Lorenzo and how he sort of recombined and did some weird things in terms of the architecture at San Lorenzo. And Andrea Palladio is someone who's kind of following in his footsteps. Now, both Michelangelo and Palladio, who basically worked in Vicenza and also in Venice, were influenced heavily by the treatise by the first century architect Vitruvius and his treatise. Remember that various people republished this. Andrea Palladio is an architect who also republished Vitruvius's treatise on architecture, and he is also very famous for being the father of a style of architecture that we call Palladian architecture. And it's actually, we'll see a lot of that when we get to the United States and to England later on. Believe it or not, in the 17 and 1800s, there was a lot of Palladian architecture influenced heavily by Palladio. So he's a real important guy to know, and to know that name as a household name. This first theater that he designs is based somewhat on the idea that there's a rebirth in theater going. In the ancient Greek era, they had theaters and they had Greek tragedy and Greek comedy, and basically Greek theater was Greek drama was an important part of Greek culture. And remember that this was a Renaissance, and so they decided they wanted to have a rebirth of Greek culture. And so they developed something that was an extension of something called Commedia dell'arte. And Commedia dell'arte were these traveling troupes who improvised on a group of stock or set characters. And during Palladio's time, there was a group who formed a theater group more or less that had some controlled screaming in it that we call opera. And this is the birth of the operatic style of singing the words, and basically was developed as a way to project the voice in ancient Greece. And I think they're taking up that style again. So this theater that he designs is an indoor theater, and I'm not really sure how well it would have been lit even at that time. They would have had things called lime lights, which were basically burning mineral lime to produce super bright light, and a bunch of lanterns and things like that. Today it has spotlighting and things like that. So what I want to do is I want to zoom in a little bit on some of these pictures and look at some of the images in them. The first thing that I want you to notice is that this is exterior architectural ornamentation, and it's used in the same way that Michelangelo used it in the interior San Lorenzo. You have a series of tiers of architectural styles with these niches and windows that really serve no purpose to support the building, but they are almost like the ornamentation on Roman triumphal arches, on the exterior of the Colosseum and things like that. So you have these columns that are placed on pedestals that are supporting a kind of fake entablature with sculptures at the top. And a lot of this is done in stucco, some of it's done in marble, and it's a design of a theater that's meant to be a skene, S-K-E-N-E. We have evolved that into saying scene, S-C-E-N-E, but basically the idea is this is a static or stationary backdrop that doesn't change, it doesn't move at all. And it's visually very interesting, it's very ornamented, but it's basically not the clean classical style that we saw from the ancient Greek period and actually from the beginning of the Renaissance when they were designing buildings. So one of the other things that is in the center of this, you'll see, is a sort of Roman triumphal arch in the center of this skene or stage set. And it has something called a forced perspective. So let's take a look at that. The Roman triumphal arch that you have here on either side of it, you see flattened pilasters with Corinthian columns, and then you see these columns that are on top of a sort of elevated base that are just meant to be ornaments. On top of that, you have these weird little blocky drops that are coming off of a cornice that we actually call dentils because they kind of look like teeth with spaces in between. And then you have a Roman triumphal arch with some figures on the very top that actually emulate some of the things that Michelangelo did in the library at San Lorenzo. Now, when you look inside the arch, you'll see this sort of infinite perspective. It seems to go way back into space, but actually what happens is the stage itself in that backdrop is lifted up. So it's actually kind of elevates up. And as you move into the back, the buildings get smaller and smaller and smaller. So someone who's standing in the front of this would be normal in scale, but as they move into the back, they would look smaller. They would look incredibly large compared to the architecture. So it's kind of what's called a forced perspective. And what they're doing is literally, sculpturally, making things smaller as it goes into the back and elevating the stage so that it seems as if it's in one-point perspective. And it was a way of giving this infinite space into the background and using what they understood about linear perspective to work on creating the illusion of space. So everything about Mannerism is an extension of the things that happen really all the way back to Masaccio in the 1400s and 1420s. And they're expanding on it and they're adding special effects, but they're also, it's like a wedding cake that's kind of out of control with all of the ornamentation and all of the details. They're knowingly showing you what they understand about architecture and architectural detail, but they're breaking the rules while they do it, even though it seems as if they're sticking to some of the rules. Palladio is also responsible for building a bunch of summer houses or country estates out in the Vicenza, in the outskirts of Venice. Now, this is kind of important because it also ties in an awful lot with the social and economic things that were going on with Venice. And in a nutshell, Venice was an extremely powerful seafaring city that was very defensible. It would be very hard to invade it. They're kind of out in the water, and the houses there are more or less built on stilts. They had a lot of trade, and they dominated the trade routes an awful lot. So one of the things that happens is you have this wealth that is happening because of Venetian trade, and you have a bunch of people who are extremely powerful who live there. But one of the things that also happens is there are people who find Venice smelly and dirty. Plague attacks Venice all the time. And so there were these sort of gentlemen courtiers who decided that they wanted to have houses out on their estates in the country. And there's this beginning of starting to see nature as being friendly rather than an enemy. And some of these people who own these estates also had food was being produced on these estates. And so it was a source of additional wealth for them, even if they had some sort of connection to the trade routes. And so Palladio designs this house called the Villa Rotunda out in Vicenza, and he designs it with 4 points of view. And if you look at the floor plan on it, it actually has 4 porches with steps on them. And these 4 porches with steps are called belvedere. A belvedere just means a beautiful bell, and then vedere means to see. And so the person who owned this home could sit out on these porches and see this beautiful countryside around them and also view their own land. Now, it's actually a retired clergyman, Monsignor, who lived there, but who was named Capra, and it's also sometimes called the Villa Capra. So the Villa Rotunda is called Rotunda because it's round, and it's sort of riffing on the Pantheon. If you look at it, but it's also a Mannerist riffing on the Pantheon, because what you have is these sort of porticos in the front with these acrotiri, which are sculptures on the top of it. And you have this architecture that looks almost like the front of the Pantheon, and then this squared off building with a dome in the center. the interior of the building would have been kind of a weird place to live, because if you look at the way the floor is divided up, and that at the sort of four corners of that round space there are actually spiral staircases that go upstairs, it's really using temple or ideal temple plan to design a private home or a private mansion. And so it's kind of a bizarre thing, but you can see it looks an awful lot like the Pantheon, but there are little weird distortions on it. For instance, if you zoom in on some of the areas, you'll see it has this portico with these Ionic columns on the front, but then it has a triumphal arch on the sides, because he's trying to find ways to solve problems. The windows and the architecture and the upper windows are kind of weird clear stories or clerestories that don't really work quite right. So it's kind of a confusing bit of architecture that's meant to be a temple, I suppose, to the person who owned it. And it's the beginnings really of not necessarily a palazzo the way that we think of palaces, but really the estates and mansions that evolve, especially in England and the United States, where it looks like an ancient Greek building or an ancient Roman building, but it looks like an ancient Roman or Greek temple rather than an ancient Greek or Roman palace. Like, for instance, when we looked at the palaces, the Medici Riccardi and others like that, and the Palazzo Rucellai, it was actually a bunch of apartment buildings that were united. Now we're having mansions that are meant to look like temples. Mannerism is also used for churches, and this San Giorgio Maggiore is a church, but it's really irrational in a lot of ways, and Palladio is sort of playing with stuff in terms of the facade of it. So in the frontal view, you can see that the church sort of expands out behind this almost stage set. It's almost like this temple with another temple that is being lifted up in the front, and it's interlocking, and it doesn't really block the church behind it, and it doesn't really hide the dome behind it. So in a way, it's almost like a scheme or a scene that we saw in the Olympic Theater, where the front of it is just basically a sort of set. Now, the other thing is the front of it looks like it's coming right out of the water, and I think that's kind of a cool thing. And it almost looks like the temple itself is an interlocking set of two pediments and two temples. One temple is elevated jigsaw style above the base of the front of the other temple. And this is also a very Mannerist thing. So you have these columns that are set on sort of pedestals that are raising an entablature, and the entablature is breaking through the pediment of another pediment, so the triangular parts of the pediments. And that, again, is a distortion. It's not a simple, clean, classical look like we saw in the Parthenon or even the front of the Pantheon. So what they're doing is they're kind of taking the classical styles that they understand, and they are riffing on it, they're improvising on it, and making it very ornate and very irregular and very strange. The interior of San Giorgio Maggiore is the same way. You can see that at the four corners of some of these structures, they have pilasters combined with engaged columns, engaged and triumphal arches on top of that. And it, in a way, is very similar to what we saw in Michelangelo's San Lorenzo, where you have this sort of irrational combining of these different layers and levels of columns that are engaged against the walls that you're not really sure if they're actually supporting the wall or if they're piers and that kind of thing. The birth of the country estate or country palace is actually something that is discussed a little bit also in Boccaccio, in the Decameron, which is a series of more or less kind of bawdy tales that were written almost like the Canterbury Tales, where you have people who are avoiding the Black Death, going out into the country, trying to get away from the diseased and infected people, and living in these private palaces that would be isolated. And they're also living out there to enjoy nature in some ways, but very often it's the idea of controlling nature or subjugating nature to the needs of the individual that's more important. That nature is beautiful, but it's beautiful if it's under control and it's not wild. So I think that the Palazzo del Te, which if you look at it dates from 1525 to 32, which dates it just before actually Michelangelo's Last Judgment, which was 1534, is a kind of extension of this idea. But you'll also see that some of the ideas in the Palazzo del Te get played out in another place that we're going to study from the 1600s called Versailles in France. So if you look at the building from this aerial point of view in the plan, you can see that what they're doing is they are designing a series of sort of parterre gardens, a segmented series of lawns and gardens that are supposed to be beautiful places to walk through and look at. The building is also sort of designed along the lines of, for instance, the Palazzo Medici Riccardi that we looked at earlier, where the aerial point of view shows that it has also a central courtyard that's sort of protected from the elements. It's a little bit more pleasant. It's almost fortress-like because it protects the people who are inside from any kind of exposure to the outside. So even though it's surrounded by a series of gardens, it also is meant to be an interior-looking building that rings around a central peristyle courtyard, although in this instance it's not strictly really a peristyle courtyard. So let's take a look at the front of it. One of the things that you can see in the front of this building is that it kind of has a moat in the front. Now, it really wasn't meant to be a defensible moat. It wasn't meant to keep out invaders or anything like that. The idea was more or less to protect the interior space, but also provide this little buffer zone. So this buffer zone of this sort of reflecting pond moat has a lot of the ornamentation that we saw, for instance, earlier in the Palazzo del Te, excuse me, not in the Palazzo del Te, in the Palazzo Rucellai and also in the Medici Riccardi, where we have rustication on the bottom. But then it moves up into a smoother sort of facade or exterior. We have Roman triumphal arches that are literally supporting the walls, and these Roman triumphal arches are actually surmounted on Doric style or Tuscan style columns that are unfluted but do have bases. And then we move inside the building, and you'll see that there are actually clusters of 4 columns that again is a sort of mannered way of designing the architecture, where you change the sizes of the columns, and you also cluster up columns when you could have just put in a pier or a single column to support that space. When you go inside the courtyard, it's again this sort of organized, almost nature in some sort of rational control. And then you have a series of rusticated wall treatments that are meant to look kind of tough or strong. And you have weird organizations of how classical architecture is used in a kind of unclassical mannered way. So what I'm suggesting is, if you look at the corners of the courtyard, the first thing that you can see is that there are these flattened pilasters, which are sort of flat columns that are engaged against the walls, and they are surrounded on either side with engaged rounded Doric or sort of Tuscany style columns, but they have different capitals at the top. And then when you get into the center of the courtyard, you see that these columns are on either side of a triumphal arch that has a pediment on top. That's stuff you wouldn't have seen at any other time until you got into the beginning of the 1500s, because it's a sort of irrational use of a lot of that ornamentation. If we zoom in on the entablature that is rising above this rustication and these sort of niches that don't have anything in them, and these windows that aren't really windows. So again, this is a mannered thing. We have an alternation that we saw, for instance, on the Parthenon, where there is an entablature that has an alternation of what's called triglyphs and metopes. And triglyphs and metopes are the 3 marked things are the triglyphs, and then in between are these metopes, which are these panels that have sculptures in them. In this instance, we have these grotesque masks that are running around the exterior of it. And we also even have something that looks an awful lot like a series of family crests and things like that. But I think that the interesting little ornament thing on these triglyphs and metopes is that Giulio Romano is actually playing with the triglyphs and metopes by actually dropping the triglyphs down in such a way that they're irrational, that triglyphs don't make sense here, and it's a knowing use of that. He also has this alternation in some of the rustication. Some of the columns, or I mean some of the blocks of stone that are coming out of the walls are alternately smooth and rough. And that's just a way to create more visual texture and make things a little bit more interesting. If you go inside the building, there is actually a series of rooms that are almost like fun houses. And so this is the Hall of the Giants. And my imagination takes me to this place where if this was a country villa that was meant to basically be a party house, and people were roaming around outside in that courtyard in the strong sun, maybe drinking and getting kind of buzzed and having a good time, and then they wandered into this building, and their eyes are adjusting and they're a little disoriented. They walk into this room, and the first thing is that the floor, the tile in the floor, and the mosaic in the floor is meant to distort and sort of throw you off, and it almost feels like a whirlpool of water that's sucking you in and moving around. And as your eyes adjust, you would look up and you would see these trompe-l'oeil architectural details of these giants, and it's called a gigantomachy or gigantomachy, which is just basically giants who are at war with each other, and they are fighting and they're tearing at these columns and pulling them down, and the whole room seems to swirl around. And then as you sort of focus in on these frescoes on the walls, you would see details, for instance, of the columns coming down, the buildings being torn down. So it's trompe-l'oeil architecture, sort of like what we saw in the Sistine Chapel ceiling, but with a sort of hallucinogenic effect. And it almost feels as if the buildings are being torn down while you're inside it, and you move up and you see these clouds and this whirling apex that's circling around, and all of these figures that are painted desato in su, from below to above. We're going to zoom in on this in a minute as well. If you zoom in on the gigantomachy or gigantomachy, and you can actually see that what Romano is doing is he's making a sort of stage set for you to have it's almost like a carnival where you go inside and there's this wonderful, the columns are coming down. You can actually see, for instance, he understands how architecture is built, and so you see the brickwork on the right-hand side with the entablatures coming off of that, so you know that he was thinking about facades. And then you actually see how the columns were put together as a series of drums with metal pipes in them, or cast iron little pegs that would hold the columns together. And he actually shows you how these things would have fit together and how they're blocked together and what they would look like as they fall apart. So he's giving you this sense of action and movement, and that really relates to the Mannerist painting that we were looking at. Remember how a lot of times in Mannerism, it's almost like the moment just before the action takes place, and that you're just about to have movement. In this instance, we do have quite a bit of movement that almost foresees what happens in the Baroque era, but it's also the idea that you're in the middle of a toppling scene. So let's take a look at the ceiling itself. We've seen ceilings like this before, and what I want to suggest is, for instance, when we looked at Mantegna's ceiling, and in the Camera Picta, we had this wonderful trompe-l'oeil design where the putti were looking down at you, and you're looking up at the ceiling, and it makes sense, and you're oriented towards the fresco. And in this way, we have the same kind of thing, and Correggio did the same thing in the Dome of Parma Cathedral that we studied before. And in this instance, we have the same kind of thing going on, but it's really pushing it, and it really swirls in, and it's meant to be disorienting at the same time you're oriented to it. So in a way, modern psychologists would call this cognitive dissonance, where you think that you understand what's going on and you're oriented towards something and you understand what you're seeing, but then at the same time it confuses you, and it's meant to confuse you and make you feel as if you're in some kind of weird wonderland. And I think that's at the heart of Italian mannerism, is that you're oriented towards things, you understand all the rules, you understand how to be well-mannered and how to use architecture and how to use all of the standard illusionistic systems, but at the same time, things get crazy and sort of distorted and whacked out. And I think that's a big chunk of how to understand mannerism.